In here on Zoom? Whoa. Welcome. Your rates will be increased by 25% and you will all be happy. Just kidding. Are we good? We good to go? Is it echoing? How about now? Better? And you can still hear on Zoom? All right. You'd think after 2 years of this, we'd get it figured out by now, right? All right. I think we got it started. So we've got a number of people that are joining us remotely, and for those of you that are joining remotely, we have Kendall, who's going to be monitoring the chat on Zoom. So feel free to send in through any questions throughout the presentation through chat feature. For those of you that are here in person, feel free to raise your hand, shout, stand up, jump on your chair, throw anything to get my attention. And we will do I will do my best to answer any and all questions that you have throughout the presentation. And I'm sure we'll probably have some time at the end for any additional questions that aren't asked as we go. So I'm going to see if we can get this a little easier to see for those that are joining remotely. Okay. All right, so we have a jam-packed agenda today. We have 3 things on the agenda. We're going to review 2021, our current year's year-to-date financial performance of the community. And then after we do that, that'll be fairly brief. We will review kind of a high-level overview of the 2022 budget plan. And and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. My goal with this presentation is to be as simple and direct as possible, and then do my best to get down into any more details based on your questions as we go. So I made several versions of this presentation, and every single one ended up being super, super complicated with tons and tons of spreadsheets, and I was going to bore you all to sleep. And so it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and we're going to be focusing really on the terraces of Los Gatos and the operations here at the terraces of Los Gatos. What we don't have in the presentation, which we can share at a later date, is details about our capital expense, our capital projects, our capital expense budget. And then if you'd like at a later date as well, we can get into some more details about Human Good as an organization. But I really wanted to spend this time focusing really on the operations here at the terraces of Los Gatos. So without further ado, here is, we're going to start off talking about revenue year to date. And everything that we look at for year to date is January through September. Month of October hasn't closed yet, or the books haven't closed yet, so we don't have details from October yet. So everything that we see is January through September. So this first slide is just an overview of total revenue by level of living. our actuals compared to the budget, and then obviously the variance. So year to date, our total revenue is just over $22 million, $22,292,000, compared to a budget of $22,191,000. So we are $102,000 ahead of budgeted revenue expectations for the year. If anyone has any questions before I move on, just shout at any time. So what this next slide is, obviously there's two graphs here, and these graphs show occupancy compared to budgeted occupancy. So the first one on the left is what we refer to as senior living. So this is a combination of independent living, assisted living, and memory care, all combined. So roughly we have a budget, the orange line is the budget of 238.5. And as you can see throughout the year, we've dipped a little bit below budget, but not too far off budget for, again, senior living, everything outside of the health center. On the right-hand side is the health center. It's a little bit more interesting. So our budgeted occupancy in the health center is 48.5. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of fluctuation in our occupancy in the health center. Anyone have any guesses what may cause that fluctuation? COVID, right? So in January and going into February, we had a few COVID cases, which meant we stopped admissions. And so as residents discharged home, we didn't necessarily replace them and have more residents that were admitted to the health center, which dropped us all the way down in the month of February. Our average occupancy in the health center was 29 out of 59 beds. So what's that, 50% occupancy, which is that right there was actually the lowest month in the history, at least as far as I know, of the health center. Went back up. We had another couple of cases of COVID, dropped back down, and it's kind of steadied off. And hopefully we maintain this occupancy as we move forward. The next slide will show us the financial impacts of these two slides. So the the blue line, now we're looking at revenue. So previous slide was occupancy, this slide is revenue. Senior living, so everything outside of the health center, revenue stays pretty consistent, a little over 1.4 million per month in revenue. Now the health center, we see that fluctuation. So February, when we're down to 29 average occupancy in the health center, we dropped down to almost $600,000 that month in revenue. Whereas in the month of June, much closer to where we traditionally are on a monthly basis, 1.2 million. So essentially half the revenue in the month of February as we would typically like to see. Any questions? I like this slide because really it shows, I like it, but it also makes me a little uneasy because it shows really the necessity and the importance of the health center occupancy for the financial stability and strength of the community. Next, so that was a high-level overview of revenue. Now we'll do a quick high-level overview of expenses. Here is our year-to-date expenses broken down by 10 or 12 different categories. First two rows are team member related. So first is salary and wages, and the other is other employee costs, mostly benefits, So as you can see, our wages, we spent so far about $250,000 more than budget on wages and $68,000 on other employee costs ahead of budget. And that is, again, year to date. Going down, direct resident care, the next row, this is a big one. And this one's always, there's always a question about this every year. What does direct resident care mean? Does anybody remember from a previous presentation what direct resident care means? Okay, remember it for next year when I ask again. But direct resident care is kind of a weird, I'm not sure why we call it that, but it is ancillary services that are provided primarily in the health center. So the way that the health center financially operates is when a patient or a resident goes into the health center and they're covered by insurance, traditionally Medicare insurance. Medicare says, okay, we're going to pay you $900 a day, and everything, all of the care that's required to take care of that individual, you pay for. And so that's therapy services. So paying the therapists, that's paying for medications, lab, radiology, all those services are the ancillary services that we pay for residents in the health center. So that's what that is. So we're $250,000 over budget spending, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's directly tied to occupancy in the health center. When occupancy goes up, that expense goes up proportionate to the occupancy levels. That being said, we've just renegotiated our contract with our therapy partners, and I'm really excited about it because it'll give us some significant savings going into the new year. Won't go through all of the other line items, but I'll give you a minute to look it over, and if anyone has any questions about anything specifically, I'd be happy to answer it. Oh.
All the testing, where did all the testing?
All of the COVID testing, where did that go? It's a good question. It went right here in this admin, and I'm not sure why, but there was a separate line item that was added specifically for COVID-related expenses, mostly COVID testing, but also COVID supplies. And it was added to this line item. So you'll see we're $454,000 over budget, and that is why. Primarily COVID testing and COVID supplies. We're really hoping that going into the new year, we won't need to spend such a large amount of money on COVID testing and supplies, but only time will tell. We actually, unfortunately, in the month of September, we got a bill from our previous lab partner who we were contracted with last year for all of our COVID testing, and we eventually got out of our contract with them because we weren't satisfied with their services, and they just sent us a bill for $215,000 for COVID tests that were conducted last year. So it's a big expense. Yes, Mr. Parrish. The question was if there's any federal support for testing since it's required, and unfortunately not. In 2020, we received some federal support, financial support, about $880,000. I can't remember the exact amount, 800 and some odd thousand that we received last year. This year, nothing. Any other questions before we move on?
What's the bad debt?
Bad debt. Good question. Thank you, Linda. Bad debt is any past due accounts receivables So bills that we are trying, or reimbursement that we are attempting to collect, that we haven't been able to collect. Once it hits 150 days past the date of service and we haven't collected it, we write it off to bad debt as a bad debt expense. We still work on collecting that money, and if and when we do, then it's added as a credit, which I'm super excited because as you can see, we have $163,000 in bad debt year to date. And due to Ronnie Santos, our Director of Finance's diligence, yesterday, we just received a check and it went to the bank for $106,000. That was all, had all gone to bad debt. Insurance, we've been fighting with insurance for over a year to settle a claim, and they finally paid. So that's great. That's great news. Group management fees. I'm so glad you asked that because this is one that everybody loves to know. This is the money that goes to Human Good to support for essentially all of the services that Human Good provides us. It's what funds the community support centers and all of the services, legal services, clinical services, risk management services, all of our salaries of all of the community support center staff, accounting, et cetera. Move on. So here's a very high level overview. We went over revenue, we went over expenses, and what that leaves us with is our operating margin. So our operating margin year to date, 2.472 million compared to budget of 3.6. So a variance of 1.1 million behind budget. So in terms of operating margin, it's been a rough year. Been a challenging year with reduced occupancy and therefore reduced revenue, and very high expenses, many of which are related to COVID, most of which is related to COVID, but not all.
Are we out of line with the other communities?
It's a really good question. The question was, are we out of line with the other communities? There's a few ways to answer that question. And I would say, and this is, I could be wrong, because I don't have the information in front of me. But if we're looking at variance to budget for operating revenue alone, we probably have, I don't know if we have the largest, but we have one of the largest variances to operating margin. That being said, we also have one of the largest operating margins of the organization. And so although we're significantly behind our budgeted operating margin, we are still not the top, but close to the top three of communities within the organization in terms of our operating margin. Now, this slide is not super exciting to see because we don't like to be that far behind our budgeted operating margin. So this is a better slide to look at. This shows our cash flow year to date. So cash from operations, which is our operating margin, variance of 1.1 million. But there's another stream of cash flow at the community, and that's cash that comes in from entry fees. And so we've had a very, very strong year after a very challenging year last year. We've had a very strong year for entrance fees. And so as you can see, our entrance fees revenue year to date is over 9 million compared to a budget of 4.4 million. So that's a really good positive variance, which overall gives us a net cash production of 3.3 or 3.7 million over overall cash budget. So going back to your question, Linda, if we look at this slide, we are knocking it out of the park and heads and tails above, not heads and tails above all communities, but we're financially strong compared to if we're stacking us up with the other communities. So thank goodness for the sales team. Yes, Mike. Good job, Linda. Where does that net cash production go? Good question. So, although we love to see this net cash production, it's not truly like cash in the bank because obviously the vast majority of it is from entrance fees. And so entrance fees, not my area of expertise of how the accounting works, but all of the entrance fees essentially go into a bank and then are amortized over years. There's some set aside as reserves for refunds for those that have, or for rebates for those that have rebatable contracts. And then the rest goes in and helps fund capital projects. So the entrance fees help cover the costs of all of the apartment remodels, which is not included in the operational expenses. Also, all of the other capital projects, so the dining room, the gallery, the fountain court, all of that is funded through the capital expense. All of the capital funding comes from the entrance fees, primarily. Yes, we know.
If only capital expenses here, which is that cash production.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It all goes into a big human good bank and then gets allocated based on needs of the communities. Go.
Some of it probably goes to in entry fees, where a portion of it is withheld to be refunded later. It's got to be put in a reserve account so that it's there when people have to draw it out again. So if there's a 75% return at the time of exit, that money cannot be used to do stuff. It's there, just sitting there.
Correct. So for those who may not have been able to hear, there are some residents who have a rebatable contract. And so there's a portion of the entrance fees that's held in a reserve to fund those rebates when needed. So that's actually it. That's the overview of year-to-date 2021. I told you I was going to keep it simple, and hopefully I did. And we're doing well on time, so we're going to move on to 2022 budget plan. Revenue minus expenses equals operating margin. So we're gonna, just like we reviewed for the 2021 year to date, we're gonna review our revenue plan, our expense plan, and then our operating margin plan for 2022. So first, what we do is we look at occupancy, and we need to make some occupancy assumptions. What was our occupancy this year? What has our occupancy been for the previous years? What do we anticipate our occupancy being in the year to come? So these are the occupancy assumptions we've made for 2022. Residential living, we kept flat. Our goal this year, our budget this year was 175 occupied units out of, or 170 occupied units on average out of 175. And that stays the same. That's our goal, our target for next year. Assisted living, no change either. 43.5 out of 45. Memory care, we dropped it a little bit. It was 15, and we dropped it to 14.5. So not a huge change. And then our health center, We also dropped a little bit as well. So our 2021 occupancy assumption for the health center is 48.5. We dropped down to 47.5. This just shows a breakdown of total revenue and the revenue sources for the year. So this is showing 2021. So you can see 40% of our revenue has come from the health center. 39% has come from residential living. And then 12% from assisted living, 7% from memory care, and then another 2% for other miscellaneous revenue. Our budget for 2022, not a huge variance, small dip in revenue in the health center. Health center and residential living just swapped a percentage.
How come that this year we have not been having enough patients? And still you're saying we will have less next year?
Yes. As a function of total revenue, yes. We're not counting on the health center as much as we have in the past, I guess.
Repeat the question.
The question was, if we had such a poor year for occupancy in the health center this year, how is it that we're planning to have a worse one next year? Because we've gone from an actual of 40% down to 39%. And so our target in the health center, occupancy target, our budget is higher than our current year to date. So we do anticipate to do better, but overall, as it all fits together, yes, the percentage is slightly lower, but the actual dollar amount is higher. Well,
I assume that also includes a fudge factor for the fact that COVID is unpredictable and we have no idea how many people.
yes, as Flo said, there is a fudge factor because we have no idea what's going to happen with COVID and how that may or may not impact occupancy in the health center in the coming year. Our goal is that we do significantly more next year in the health center, but we just don't want to bet the farm on that because it's so unpredictable at this time. Linda?
Isn't it also true that our budgets are pretty much a numbers game, and the numbers we put in there, our goals are ones we are fairly comfortable in ordinary circumstances. So that we are over budget in year where we do well during.
I will do my best to repeat what Linda just said. And hopefully no one from a finance department is listening. But she said, isn't it true that the budgeting process to a certain degree is a numbers game where we have a target and then it's a matter of working with the numbers to find something that we're comfortable with and isn't necessarily going to be what will actually happen? Yes. To a certain degree, for sure. We always hope to do significantly better than what we budget for, but these are challenging times, so that's not always the case these days.
How comfortable are you with these numbers?
How comfortable am I with these numbers? Hold that question and we'll get to it a little bit later when we start talking about labor and wages, staffing. Okay, so now, so we did a high level overview of revenue. Now we're going to get into some expense considerations. There are three main things that we consider when we look at our expense planning. Team members, specifically the number of team members that we have, the FTE count, or the full-time equivalent count. Then we look at our team members' wages. We need to make some decisions there. And then we look at everything else that's a non-wage expense, services, supplies, and everything else. So we're going to go through each one of these items briefly. FTE count. So in 2021, we were budgeted to have 212 full-time team members. Typically, we have about 200 full-time team members and then maybe another 20 or so part-time team members. But to sort of equal 212 full-time team members. Our actual was 208 or 209. So we were a little below our budgeted team member count for a number of reasons. Now, this doesn't actually mean we had 208 actual full-time team members. It was more likely that we had 201 or 202, and a lot of people working a lot of extra shifts and a lot of extra overtime. So all of those hours are included in the overall count. Our budget for 2022 is 216. So we hope to be able to add an additional 7 team members to our team member count. Wages. We have budgeted in the 2022 budget plan an average increase of 4.35% for team member wages. Doesn't necessarily mean, okay, every team member is going to get a 4.35% increase, but that's what we've sort of allocated. We've taken the average hourly, or the average wages of all of our team members, and when we went through the budgeting process, what we determined we would need to do for increases, the average is 4.35%. That includes taking into considerations for turnover. All that being said, going back to Linda's comment earlier about it being a little bit of a numbers game, as you can see here, there's an asterisk. If you can't see it, there's the asterisk. 4.35% on average isn't going to cut it. The reality is, we're going to need to pay our team members on average more than 4.35% what we're currently paying them in 2021. But the challenge is, if we would have said, okay, we're going to increase that to 10%, we've got to come up with the money in the budget to be able to fund that. So then we're going to really start pushing the envelope in terms of what our occupancy assumptions are and ultimately what the monthly fees are. And that's just going to drive that up. So we have to play a little bit of a numbers game, as Linda said, to find a number that we're comfortable with, putting in the budget, with the hopes and the expectations that we're able to exceed our revenue to a degree sufficient enough that we can actually fund an average wage increase of higher than 4.35%. Just to kind of put it into perspective a little bit, this is an extreme example, but it's a real example. We are currently trying to hire some new nurses, additional nurses in the health center. And we're also trying to hire some new nurses in wellness as well. But we're really in dire need for some additional nurses in the health center. We have staffing agencies that we work with, and they provide supplemental staffing, but even they're struggling and they don't have staffing. And so our average hourly wage for a registered nurse currently is about $45 an hour. we just posted positions for on-call, not full-time, but on-call registered nurses in the hopes of being able to build up an on-call pool of when somebody's sick or somebody needs to go out on leave or somebody's can't make it in because their child school got closed because of COVID or whatever the case may be, that we can call. We have a pool of nurses that we can call and they can come and work. Any guesses on what we've published or posted those positions, the hourly wage for that? So we got a 50, we got a 60, we got a 70. $45 an hour is our current wage on average. At $80 an hour is what we posted. We posted it last week. We've got 3 applicants, which we're happy about those 3 applicants. But that's just indicative of what we, as well as everybody else in the industry, are up against right now.
How do we expect to increase our headcount above what we had before, when we can't get people?
Question is, how do we expect to increase our headcount right now as in this difficult labor market? There's a couple of things that we're doing. One, we are taking a really hard look at the wages that we're offering and figuring out what we need to do to bring in those team members. On the one hand, you know, we can't afford to pay a nurse $80 an hour, but on the other hand, we can't afford not to. So taking a real hard look at wages. Also, we have a lot of initiatives that we're working on locally as well as at a company level to address the challenge. We have a working group that is focused exclusively on the recruitment process. As an organization with Human Good, we have a much larger recruitment. We have a whole recruitment department, which we didn't previously have before this year. And so they are doing a lot of work to recruit. Also, we have just posted a new position for another full-time team member within our human resources department that will be focused on the recruitment and onboarding process for new team members as well. That will hopefully help us be able to bring in some more team members. It is an uphill climb though, for sure.
Can't stay ahead of the housing
We can't stay ahead of the housing.
costs here.
Yes, you're correct.
Unless until Human Good does something about housing in the entire area, we're pretty much stuck, it seems to me.
Yes.
Repeat, please.
Unless we do something about housing, we're stuck because we can't compete with the already high and rapidly rising costs of living here in the area. You're absolutely correct.
Is there something in the works that Human Good is?
Nothing.
If the answer is no, why not? Repeat the question, please.
Is there anything that Human Good is doing or has in the works to address that problem? And the answer is we don't have the answer yet. No. We're trying to find those solutions, but we have not found them yet. All right, so this next slide shows the last 3 years of actual numbers compared to our budgeted numbers for 2022. And this is total employee costs. So we see from 2019 to 2020, our total employee costs, everything all in, increased only by 0.71%. And that is, I won't get into the details of why that's the case. But from 2020 to 2021, our total employee cost has increased by 3.31%, which is a sizable increase. We anticipate, based on our budget plan for 2022, compared to our annualized 2021 numbers, an increase of 2.57%. And we remember that asterisk. It's just as big here because this is a very conservative estimate of what the increase will be for our employee costs. Again, it will likely be, we'll see an increase significantly higher than that. But if we work that into the budget, it comes on the back of monthly fees. Non-wage expenses. A lot of challenges that we're facing. This is a super exciting presentation, right? There's not enough people, we gotta pay more money than we're budgeted, and supplies and everything costs more. It's true, it's not super exciting. This isn't my favorite presentation of the year, but thank you for bearing with me. So our non-wage expenses, inflationary and supply chain pressures. There's demand surge and supply shortage in nearly every area. I just put a few examples up here. Office supplies, we've seen and anticipate even greater increases, up to 10% cost increase on office supplies, cleaning supplies, about 15%. Raw food costs, we've seen up to 50% or more, actually, depending on what the items are. And personal protective equipment, COVID supplies, the sky's the limit. I mean, we used to pay maybe 75 cents for an N95 mask, and they got up to like $3 or $4. And it's just, I mean, it's all over the place. It's a lot smaller than I anticipated. But I wanted to share this because this is a letter actually that we just got the other day. Jerry sent this to me from one of our vendors, and it's even too small for me to read. But let's see. I won't read the whole thing, but it says, we're stretching every resources. We must get through these very challenging and unpredictable times, et cetera, et cetera. Our business is not immune to the catastrophic impacts of the COVID pandemic. Due to massive increases in costs, lack of supply, and labor shortage, we're forced to increase your prices. Some examples of the unprecedented cost increases that they're seeing are wheat flour increase of 55% and climbing, wheat gluten increase of 13%, packaging 17%, oils and shortenings 100 to 200% cost increase. Corrugated boxes, 33 to 45%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really, we're getting it from all directions. The residual impacts of the pandemic. This is just one example of several, and we'll likely continue to see more and more notices like this. So our non-wage expenses. Again, this is the trend for the past 3 years, and then what we anticipate or what we're budgeting for next year. 2020 to 2021, huge increase of 14.1%. And even though we hope to stay relatively in line with where we're at this year, where that line is compared to previous years is obviously significantly higher. We anticipate that we won't need to spend as much on COVID supplies and COVID testing, we're hoping. And so on the one hand, that would drive this down, but then all the increasing costs of everything else sort of we anticipate will neutralize it compared to where we are this year. So again, revenue minus expenses equals our operating margin. So if we look at, we have our operating margin, our budget, our targets compared to our actuals for the past 3 years, and then what our operating margin budget is for next year. 5.4 million in 2019, 2020, 2021. Obviously, we took a big hit in our operating margin for all the reasons we've been talking about. We dropped down to 3.5, 3.6, and down to 3.3 million annualized for this year. We are optimistic that next year will be a much better year than this year and the previous year, but we're cautiously optimistic. We don't anticipate we'll get back to where we were pre-COVID-19, back to where we were in 2019. I could have gone back further, and operating margins were actually a little higher in previous years. So our budget for 2022 is 4.5 million, which is lower than our target from last year, which was slightly lower than our target from the previous year. Now, the big question is, how do we get there? Orange is our actuals operating margin for the last 3 years, and 2021 is annualized, so what we predict by the end of 2021. And then the blue is the budget. So our budget was a little higher in 2020, but that's when COVID hit, so the actual was significantly lower. So we're at a 3.44% reduction in our budgeted occupancy or budgeted operating margin for last year. For the coming year, we've dropped that even further, a drop of 6% from previous year. And this is how we get there. So for all levels of living, with the exception of memory care, our monthly fee increase will be 5.25%, and memory care will be 4.9%. The reason that memory care is a little bit lower is it's already really expensive in memory care. And we weren't comfortable pushing it up to that 5.25%. We're not super comfortable pushing it to 4.9%, but that's as comfortable as we could feel. So, one last slide before we open it up for questions. And this I get is really difficult to see. If you have friends that live in other communities, I don't know if they know this information yet, so please don't share anything. It's probably small enough that it's difficult to read anyway. But this is our anticipated or our monthly fee increases for all of our communities throughout the Human Good portfolio. So Terraces de los Gatos, 5.25% for just looking at residential living. Several other communities are at 5.25%, 5.5%, one down at 4.9%. Keep going. Anyone planning on moving to Boise? Monthly fee increase for the Terraces of Boise. Can anyone read that?
17,000. Wow.
17%. So thank goodness we don't live in Boise. Overall, it's still cheaper, I'm sure. But they're experiencing some challenges there, just like the rest of us, but a little bit more severe. Questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Barish.
Budget process take into account what's going on in the market area, because there's a brand new senior living community opening up to the east of us. That's another one. Construction's in the west, that's not going to be back. Opening up equal in size.
So the question was, does the budget process take into consideration what's going on in the market? We have several new senior living communities that are underway, under construction in the area. Some will be direct competitors, some will be indirect competitors. And yes, that's definitely a consideration when we go through the budgeting process. We anticipate that at least sort of at a high level, there will be increased market demand, which will help balance out the increased supply that we'll see in senior living communities, but it certainly is a consideration.
The part that seems sensitive is employees, and the demand for employees, not necessarily just competing for occupants, but for competing.
The comment was, what may be most significant is not necessarily the competition for occupancy, but the competition for employees. And yes, that is a significant factor. I was online looking through one of these sort of networking or recruiting pages, and I saw a big ad for a senior living community in the area that will be opening soon, saying we're now hiring, and I took my breath away for a second. My heart started pounding really fast and started sweating, and it's a real thing. It's hard, and it will get more challenging as there's more competition. Linda.
What's happening with our benevolence fund? Cost for the residents needing benevolence.
So the question is, what's happening with our benevolence fund? Because as the cost of living increases, the need for benevolent support will also likely increase. And yes, those two things do go hand in hand. Currently, we have very, very low benevolence need at the community. We don't anticipate a significant increase in need within the next 6 months to a year, but we anticipate that in the coming years, there will be an increased need for benevolence. And not that I don't want to overstep my bounds, but there is a very exciting opportunity to learn more about the foundation and benevolence program on November 16th, and you'll hear more soon.
Going back to increasing costs, I made a calculation. In 15 years, my monthly fees would have doubled. But that would certainly start making me.
So
Our pensions are fixed. Security goes up to 3%. We have 5% fixed every year. We would have doubled in 15 years.
So the comment was rough calculations over the course of 15 years, monthly fees I could potentially double. And I think that although we hope that's not the case, that time will tell. We're hoping that obviously the rate of inflation will stabilize over time, and we won't see a increase at the same rates that we're currently seeing. But time will tell. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Clemmer.
What's the percentage increase for the buyer?
The percentage increase for entrance fees. Linda, do you know what the percentage is? It's higher than 5.25%.
My knowledge, it's not been confirmed.
Okay,
to me yet,
okay, I think, yeah.
but it could be likely.
We haven't finalized what the increase will be. Nothing is official yet, but there's talk it will likely be closer to, up to potentially up to 10% from our existing current entrance fees. And what we're realizing is that just like we've seen this year, our cash flow from operations is down, but our cash flow from entrance fees is up. Typically, we've kept those two banks completely separate. What we're realizing is it's going to continue to be more and more challenging to drive that cash flow from occupancy. And so we need to balance that out, and we can, and I think that the market, at least right now, allows us to balance that out with a higher increase in our entrance fees. Linda, you had a question or comment earlier that I forgot to go back to.
Thank you. I was just going to comment to what Paul was asking about competitors, because obviously every year the sales teams for every community does a competitive sales analysis to look at those new competitors and other things in the market that might contribute, whether it's threats or opportunities or what have you. And so in light of the new communities that are coming up, like you said, some may be more direct, some indirect. I think most of them are still pretty indirect competitors. Most of those communities will be month-to-month rental communities. So as you know, when you were doing your research, it just means, those communities may not have entrance fees, but what I find when I'm comparing those, my team and I, while there's no community fees and they can save in that area to keep their money maybe invested somewhere, their monthly fees are sometimes double what ours are. And then I think when people are researching, they realize too, if there's no skilled nursing on site, where there's not in those communities, they don't have the benefit of a lifetime contract. So they feel like there's more risk involved, but just knowing that the monthly fees are double sometimes is a turnoff for a lot of those prospects who are searching. And then I kind of see the same thing in regards to, while the employment market is bad, right, and it's hard for us to get people, they may, those new communities may offer higher rates initially to draw people in. But what I've also seen in the last year or two is, and I would never mention names of communities, I'm sure they're doing the best they can and great things for the residents, but those communities tend to have really high employee turnover. I can't say how thankful I am to be in a community like this, where we see the longevity of the teams and all the departments that we have. I have people from other communities that have been like in a newly open community, maybe less than a year, that call me asking, are you guys hiring, or do you have an opening in the sales team, or and in one specific instance, when I found a new community, I had two people searching, wanting to leave because they actually told me that none of the management team that opened that community are there any longer. So that's the trend that I see with some of those for-profit, freestanding communities, unfortunately, is that they have rampant turnover. So I think for new people going in, whether it be team members or residents, I think they see that as a little bit of a risk.
So Linda just said some really, really insightful things, and I won't try to repeat all of them. But essentially, yes, there's new direct and indirect competition for both occupancy as well as for staffing and team members. There are always challenges when there are new communities that are being opened up and built from the ground up in terms of resident satisfaction, team member satisfaction, high turnover rates. And most of them, as Linda mentioned, are month to month, which oftentimes command a higher monthly fee on average. And so, yes, you're right, and it's definitely in our favor that we're a well-established community, both for residents and prospective residents, as well as our team members. I heard an interesting statistic actually yesterday or the day before, that nationwide, month-to-month, senior living communities, the average length of occupancy is between 18 and 24 months is all, which was surprising to me. And not that that's, I don't know, not to say it's a bad thing, but it just shows that there's really it is a different product that we offer here at the Terraces compared to the month-to-month communities. Anyways, we're past time, but I want to thank everyone for being here. This presentation has been recorded if everything worked as planned, and we will make a recording available as well for anyone that wasn't able to attend. If you think of any questions at any time, feel free to reach out to me, and appreciate you being here and being a part of our community, and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Hey, thank you. Appreciate it, man.